The rhythmic clatter of my grandfather's old Seth Thomas clock was usually the loudest sound in my living room at 10:00 p.m. Sometimes, if the wind was high, the gentle sigh of the ancient oak in my front yard would join in, a comforting whisper against the window panes. For 22 years, that's been my normal here in Fairview, Pennsylvania, a quiet suburb where the houses are mostly brick, the yards are mostly green, and the only drama usually involved a runaway dog or an overzealous leaf blower. I'm Silas Croft, 42 years old, and my peace, hard-won and deeply cherished, was the bedrock of my existence. I consider myself an observant man. It's not a hobby, it's a way of life, especially when you've been rooted in the same spot for over 2 decades. You see the subtle shifts in the seasons, the new saplings growing into sturdy trees, the subtle ways neighbors interact. And yes, you also see the patterns. That's where the jadedness comes in. After a while, you learn to spot trouble before it even thinks about knocking on your door, or more accurately, before it starts pouring concrete on your neighbor's property. The concrete incident wasn't just a random act of idiocy. Not for Victor Blackwood, the man who lived next door to me, and more directly to Clara Jenkins, the woman whose yard was currently being invaded. No, for Victor, this was an escalation, a bold declaration in his ongoing, unspoken war against the very concept of boundaries. I'd seen his type before, and honestly, after 20 years of his particular brand of nuisance, my jadedness had curdled into a quiet, simmering contempt. I knew Victor Blackwood. I knew his charming smiles that promised nothing but future headaches, his profuse apologies that were merely tactical retreats, and his utter disdain for anyone else's property rights. Clara had moved in about 3 years ago, a single woman, quiet, meticulous with her garden, a stark contrast to Victor's chaotic, perpetually unfinished projects. I'd seen her out there, tending her rose bushes, her small vegetable patch. She was the picture of quiet contentment, exactly the kind of person Victor Blackwood seemed to instinctively prey upon. He started small with her, just like he had with others on our block over the years. A sprinkler head angled to drench her walkway, a strategically placed pile of leaves from his yard blowing into hers, the occasional late-night DIY project with power tools. Minor annoyances, easily dismissed, but I was observant enough to recognize the pattern, a slow, deliberate chipping away at another person's peace. But this concrete debacle was different. This was blatant. It started on a Tuesday morning, bright and early, just as I was pouring my first cup of coffee. The roar of a small backhoe shattered the morning quiet, followed by the guttural grind of a concrete mixer. I walked to my kitchen window, sipping my coffee, and watched. My jaw tightened. Victor Blackwood standing there, arms crossed, a smirk on his face, directing a crew of bewildered-looking laborers. They were tearing up a section of Clara's side yard, a strip of pristine green between her house and his, where her vibrant azaleas usually bloomed. Within hours, the fresh, dark gray of new concrete spread, expanding his already oversized driveway, encroaching on her land by a good 10-12 feet. My jadedness told me he believed Clara wouldn't notice or wouldn't care enough to act. It was the classic bully's calculation: target the quiet one, the one who seems least likely to fight back. But my observance told me Clara Jenkins was quietly tenacious, and my 2 decades of simmering resentment towards Victor Blackwood told me this was the moment. This was the straw that broke the camel's back, not just for Clara, but for the entire street and for me. That jerk needed a lesson, a permanent one, not just a slap on the wrist, but something that would ensure he never again disturbed the peace of Fairview. The next morning, the concrete was set, cold and immutable, a gray scar on Clara's green landscape. She stood there, coffee mug clutched in her hand, staring at it. Her shoulders were slumped, her face a mixture of confusion and quiet dismay. I watched her, feeling a familiar wave of protective anger. This wasn't just about property lines, it was about the sanctity of one's home, one's haven. Victor Blackwood had desecrated that. I knew Clara was a reasonable person, likely to try a polite conversation first. My jadedness knew exactly how that would go. Victor would charm, he'd deflect, he'd promise to look into it, and then do absolutely nothing. I had seen it countless times. My own experiences with him over a minor fence repair many years ago, and his casual habit of parking his oversized pickup truck partially on my property line, had taught me the futility of reason with him. He understood only one language: consequence. I decided to give Clara a day or two to navigate her initial, probably fruitless, attempts. I wanted her to reach a certain level of frustration herself, to be receptive to a different kind of advice. Besides, I needed to gather my own thoughts, to transition from silent observer to cautious ally. I walked my own property line that evening, running my hand over the weathered wood of my fence, a barrier that had stood firm against Blackwood's subtle encroachments for years. I needed to plan. The question that gnawed at me was, how do you deliver a permanent lesson to someone who believes himself above all lessons? The clock ticked, the concrete dried. And the tension in our usually placid neighborhood thickened, palpable even through closed windows. I knew without a shadow of a doubt that this was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. It was time for a deeper, more profound kind of intervention, one that would go beyond mere property lines and cut straight to the core of Victor Blackwood's inflated sense of entitlement. My quiet life was about to get a lot less quiet, but perhaps in the end, the long-term peace would be worth the temporary disruption. This was going to be a story, I realized, one that deserved to be told. In fact, if you find yourself enjoying this kind of tale, you might want to consider subscribing to Neighbours From Hell channel for new Neighbours From Hell stories daily. 2 days after the concrete appeared, Clara Jenkins finally knocked on Victor Blackwood's door. I was working in my garage, pretending to organize tools, but my ears were perked. I heard the muffled murmur of voices, then Victor's booming, overly cheerful tone, followed by Clara's quieter, more insistent replies. A few minutes later, the door slammed shut. I saw Clara walk back across her lawn, her shoulders even more slumped than before, her pace slow and defeated. That was my cue. I waited an hour, letting her internalize the futility of polite engagement. Then I walked over. She was sitting on her porch swing, staring at the gray slab, a half-empty mug of something forgotten beside her. "Rough couple of days, Clara?" I asked, my voice pitched low, intentionally calm. I didn't want to startle her, just offer a quiet presence. She looked up, her eyes tired. "Sila's, yeah, he said he didn't realize. He said the crew must have made a mistake. Promised he'd look into it. Can you believe that?" He was standing there, directing them. My jadedness flared, but I kept my voice even. "I believe it. I've known Victor a long time, 20 years almost. He's got a knack for not realizing things when it suits him, and his looking into it usually means waiting for you to give up." She sighed, a heavy, weary sound. "So what do I do? Just live with half my yard gone. My azaleas are buried under that monstrosity." Her voice cracked slightly, a hint of the frustration that was boiling beneath the surface. My goal was to turn that frustration into action. "You don't," I said, stepping closer, leaning against the porch railing. "You absolutely do not. What Victor did, Clara, is a pretty serious transgression. He essentially stole a piece of your land, and in Fairview and pretty much everywhere else you don't just get to do that." Her eyes widened slightly, a flicker of hope amidst the despair. "But what can I do?" Acted like I was being unreasonable. He even offered to plant a new bush somewhere else on my property, as if that would make up for it. She laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Well, first off," I began, shifting my weight, my resourceful side kicking in, "you need proof. Official, undeniable proof. Did you have a property survey done when you bought the place?" She nodded. "Of course, it's in the stack of closing documents somewhere." "Good, find it. And then you'll need to get a new survey done. Mark the exact property line." Victor was supposed to do that before any construction near a boundary, especially something like this. He skipped that step deliberately, I'd wager. I paused, letting that sink in. Once you have undeniable proof that he built on your land, you take it to an attorney. Not just any attorney, but one who specializes in real estate and property disputes. Someone who knows how to deal with characters like Victor. Clara looked hesitant. "An attorney, that sounds expensive and drawn out." "It can be," I conceded, "but sometimes a single, sharp letter from a legal professional is all it takes to make someone like Victor realize their game is up. He thrives on people being too polite, too afraid of confrontation, or too worried about cost. He banks on it. He needs a dose of reality. You need to show him you mean business, that you won't be pushed around." I lowered my voice. "And Clara, this isn't just about your yard. This is about establishing a boundary, not just physically, but morally. If you let him get away with this, he'll only push harder. Believe me, I know." That last part hit home. She looked at me, truly seeing me for the first time as something more than just the quiet neighbor across the street. She saw the jaded wisdom, the quiet authority born of experience. "You've dealt with him before," I gave a grim nod. "Minor things, boundary issues, noise complaints, nothing as brazen as this. But I've seen his pattern. He's a manipulator, a user. He'll apologize only when cornered, and even then it's a feigned apology, a tactic. This isn't about him being sorry. It's about him realizing he messed with the wrong person this time, and you, Clara, are the wrong person." I offered a small, encouraging smile. "I can give you the name of a good real estate lawyer if you like. Mine. He's sharp, and he doesn't suffer fools." A spark ignited in her eyes. "You would, absolutely. Look out for each other here, or at least we should, especially against the likes of Victor Blackwood." My internal monologue added, "This is the path to the permanent lesson." This wasn't just about Clara's azaleas. It was about finally, definitively, ridding the neighborhood of its blight. The concrete was just the tip of a very annoying iceberg, and I was ready to start chipping away at the whole thing. The next few days were a blur of activity for Clara, which I observed with a quiet satisfaction. She found her old survey, called the lawyer I recommended, and then arranged for a new survey to be done. The surveyor's little flags, bright orange against the gray concrete, stood like tiny sentinels on the true property line, a defiant demarcation. Victor Blackwood, I noticed, kept his distance during this. He was probably observing Clara's methodical movements, realizing, perhaps, that she wasn't as easily intimidated as he'd hoped. The initial amusement on his face had faded, replaced by a subtle, almost imperceptible flicker of concern. Good, the attorney, Mr. Thompson, was true to his word. efficient, direct, and completely unimpressed by Blackwood's usual bluster. He drafted a formal letter, concise and legally airtight, demanding the immediate removal of the encroaching concrete and the restoration of Clara's property to its original state. It also mentioned the cost of the survey and the attorney's fees. It wasn't an aggressive letter, just a statement of undeniable fact backed by legal precedent and a clear intent to pursue the matter in court if necessary. Clara kept me updated. He received the letter yesterday, she told me, her voice a mix of trepidation and anticipation. Mr. Thompson said he faxed it and sent it certified mail. Victor hasn't said a word to me. He won't, I predicted, my jadedness knowing Victor's playbook inside and out. He'll process it. He'll weigh his options. He'll realize that the cost of fighting it or letting it go to court will be far higher than simply complying. His pride might get bruised, but his wallet will be screaming, and scream it did. The very next morning, the same backhoe, the same concrete mixer, the same bewildered crew appeared. This time, however, they weren't laying concrete. They were tearing it out. The crunch of the hydraulic breaker against the hardened concrete was a symphony to my ears. I watched from my kitchen window, a quiet, almost smug satisfaction spreading through me. Clara was out on her porch, watching too, a faint smile playing on her lips. Victor Blackwood was nowhere to be seen. He was undoubtedly sulking indoors, perhaps nursing his wounded ego with a cheap beer and a lifetime of self-pity. By late afternoon, the concrete was gone. The raw earth, churned and scarred, lay exposed, a stark contrast to the verdant lawn it had once been. The crew packed up, leaving behind a neat pile of concrete rubble at the edge of Victor's driveway, awaiting removal. Later that evening, just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the Fairview sky in hues of orange and purple, I saw Victor Blackwood emerge from his house. He walked over to Clara's yard, his shoulders slumped, his usual swagger replaced by a hesitant, almost nervous shuffle. "Clara," he began, his voice surprisingly subdued. I just wanted to apologize. Sincerely, my crew, they made a mistake. I should have been more careful. I admit I knew it was close to your line, but I never intended to actually build on your property. It was an oversight, a terrible oversight." He even managed to squeeze out a few crocodile tears, rubbing his eyes with the back of his hand. I watched from my own porch, unseen in the deepening twilight. My jadedness recoiled. The audacity of the man, an oversight. After 2 decades of observing his calculated aggressions, this transparent attempt at manipulation was almost laughable. The Reddit post said he admitted that he knew, which was technically true, but his apology was just a feeble attempt to mitigate the damage to his reputation, or perhaps to ward off further consequences. He wasn't sorry for what he did. He was sorry he got caught. Clara, to her credit, didn't melt. She stood her ground, arms crossed. "Victor, you were directing them. You stood there and watched them rip up my yard. This wasn't an oversight. This was a deliberate act." Her voice was firm, no longer wavering. He shifted uncomfortably. I know, and I am truly sorry. It won't happen again, I promise. I'll even pay to have your yard resodded, and maybe I can plant you a new azalea bush, a bigger one, to make up for it." His old habits died hard. He was still trying to buy his way out of true accountability, to offer a small sop to avoid the real reckoning. "Just remove the rubble from the edge of my property, Victor," Clara said, her voice chillingly calm, "and make sure nothing like this ever happens again, because next time I won't be as understanding." She turned and walked back into her house, leaving Victor standing alone in the fading light, looking utterly deflated. I felt a small flicker of triumph. Clara had handled him beautifully. She hadn't let him off the hook, but she also hadn't engaged in a shouting match. She had stated her boundary, clear and concise. But my jadedness whispered a warning. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Victor Blackwood was like a cockroach. You could spray him, but he'd always scuttle back into the cracks, waiting for his moment to reemerge. The concrete was gone, but the scar remained, not just on Clara's lawn, but on the fabric of our quiet street. The simple fact that it had happened at all, that Victor Blackwood had felt so entitled, so immune to consequences, confirmed my deepest conviction. The jerk needed a more permanent lesson. A fence, as Clara was planning, was a good first step, a physical barrier. But what he really needed was a permanent removal from the equation, or at the very least, a complete and utter disarming of his ability to cause trouble. The idea, vague at first, began to coalesce in my mind. This wasn't just about Victor infringing on Clara's property. It was about his pattern, his 2 decades of minor aggressions, his constant pushing of boundaries. There had to be a way to leverage that history, to turn it into something insurmountable for him. This was where my observant, jaded, and now increasingly resourceful traits would truly come into play. This wasn't just Clara's problem anymore. This was my quiet war, fought on behalf of all the peace-loving residents of Fairview. The thought filled me with a steely resolve, and that resolve, I knew, would lead me down paths less traveled, perhaps even into the shadows of Victor Blackwood's past. The days following the concrete removal were deceptively calm. Victor Blackwood, chastened by the lawyer's letter and Clara's cool resolve, kept his distance. He even hired a landscaping crew to resod Clara's damaged lawn, a visible concession to defeat. Clara, meanwhile, started planning her fence, meticulously researching contractors and designs. A high privacy fence, she told me, would be a symbol of her reclaimed peace, a visual barrier against the jerk. I encouraged her, of course. A good fence makes good neighbors, as the old saying goes, especially when one of those neighbors is Victor Blackwood. But for me, the fence was just a bandage. My jadedness screamed that this was only a temporary reprieve. Blackwood would be back in some form or another once he felt the heat was off. His type always did. They were like a persistent rash, flaring up whenever the conditions were right. My observant nature wouldn't let me rest. I started digging, quietly, systematically. My motivation for a permanent lesson was a low thrum beneath my skin. I began with public records, property taxes, permits, any historical data I could find on his house. It was tedious work, hours spent on dusty government websites, navigating arcane databases. But I had time and I had purpose. I remembered small details from years past. Rumors, whispers among longtime residents, about Blackwood's initial renovations when he first moved in, about a shed he'd built in his backyard years ago that seemed too big, about a time a decade ago when the town had sent him a notice about a drainage issue, but it had somehow vanished. These were the kinds of things an observant person like me would file away, unnoticed by most, but now they felt like breadcrumbs leading to a larger truth. I compiled a mental timeline of his transgressions. The fence he extended beyond his property line with the Millers 10 years ago, quietly rectified after they threatened legal action. The drainage pipe he rooted directly into Mrs. Henderson's backyard, causing a perpetual muddy patch. She had been too frail to fight him effectively. The endless parade of loud, late-night parties that would often spill onto the street. Each incident, minor on its own, painted a picture of a man who consistently pushed, prodded, and exploited until met with overwhelming force. One afternoon, while researching old property surveys of the area, a detail snagged my attention. A faint, almost invisible line on a very old plat map of Fairview from the 1970s. It indicated an easement, a specific portion of land designated for public utility access, running along the back of several properties on our street, including Victor's. This wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the notation about a specific small municipal storm drain access point, long since buried and forgotten, located precisely where Victor's oversized shed now stood. My jadedness told me this wasn't a coincidence. My resourcefulness kicked into high gear. I cross-referenced the old plat map with the current zoning regulations. Sure enough, any structure built on a utility easement, especially one covering a municipal access point, required a specific permit or often was strictly prohibited. And knowing Victor, he probably hadn't bothered with permits for the shed at all. It looked like something he'd thrown up over a weekend. This was it. This was the opening. A structural violation, potentially a long-standing one, hidden in plain sight. This was far more significant than a driveway encroachment. This could lead to a demolition order, fines, perhaps even a forced sale if he couldn't afford to rectify it. This was the permanent lesson I'd been seeking. I began to feel a grim satisfaction, but also a rising tide of outrage. How many rules had this man skirted? How many quiet neighbors had he steamrolled over the years, confident in his impunity? The despair of living next to such a person, seeing them get away with it time and again, was a heavy weight. My anger intensified. This wasn't just about Clara or me anymore. This was about justice for every resident of Fairview who had quietly endured Victor Blackwood's reign of error. I dedicated my evenings to building my case. I took high-resolution photos of the shed from various angles, noting its exact dimensions, its proximity to the back fence. I found archived zoning maps, building codes from the year the shed was likely constructed. I even contacted the Fairview Municipal Archives, pretending to be a history buff, to inquire about old storm drain systems in our area. The librarian, a kindly woman, provided me with a treasure trove of forgotten diagrams and old engineering reports. The deeper I delved, the more layers of Victor Blackwood's shoddy, corner-cutting life I uncovered. His pool, put in 5 years ago, lacked the proper fencing permit for a time, a fact I remembered from a fleeting newspaper article. His tree removal service, which he occasionally operated from his backyard, likely violated commercial zoning laws for a residential area. Each new discovery fueled my determination. He wasn't just a jerk. He was a walking, talking violation of good citizenship. There were moments, late at night, when doubt would creep in. Was I going too far? Was this vendetta becoming obsessive? The psychological toll of focusing so intensely on another person's flaws, even a deeply flawed person like Victor, was considerable. My mind would race, cataloging every petty slight, every arrogant smirk. I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling a profound sense of helplessness. Here I was, a man of peace, meticulously planning the downfall of another human being. It felt heavy. But then I would remember Clara's face, etched with despair as she looked at her ruined lawn. I would recall the quiet resignation in Mrs. Henderson's eyes when her backyard became a swamp. I'd think of all the years Victor Blackwood had disrupted the harmony of our street, taking, never giving, always believing himself above the rules. My jadedness would return, stronger than before, overriding the doubt. He needed this. We all needed this. The peace of Fairview depended on it. This was not a vendetta, it was a cleansing. I knew the fence Clara was planning would be built soon. That would be a visible symbol of her recovery and a partial victory, but I wanted more. I wanted something that would ensure Victor Blackwood never had the chance to inflict his particular brand of hell on anyone in this neighborhood again. My plan was risky, intricate, and required perfect execution, and in my heart, I knew it was the only way. If you're finding yourself drawn into the intricacies of this neighborhood drama and want to hear more stories where peace is fought for and earned, subscribe to Neighbours From Hell channel for new Neighbours From Hell stories daily. The fence construction began on Clara's property a week later. Tall, sturdy, 6-foot cedar planks rose steadily, creating an undeniable barrier between her yard and Victor Blackwood's. He watched from his own driveway, a grim expression on his face, his usual bluster replaced by a sullen silence. The fence was a literal and metaphorical wall against his brand of aggression. It was a victory, a significant one, and I could see the relief in Clara's posture. She was reclaiming her space, her peace. But I knew, and my jadedness always reminded me, that a fence could be scaled, physically or legally. It wouldn't address the root cause, Victor Blackwood himself. My focus remained on the larger strategy, the permanent lesson I was determined to deliver. My research into the storm drain easement in Blackwood's shed had yielded an astonishing amount of incriminating detail. The original plat map, clearly marking the easement. The old engineering reports detailing the specific location of the access point. Current Fairview zoning ordinances explicitly prohibiting permanent structures on such easements without specific, difficult-to-obtain variances. And crucially, no record of any permit for Blackwood's shed. I spent another week consolidating my evidence, cross-referencing dates, printing out official documents, creating a timeline of Blackwood's probable construction of the shed and the lack of permits. I even used a small, handheld GPS device to confirm the exact coordinates of the shed relative to the documented easement and the old storm drain access point. It was all there, clear as day. I didn't want to go to the police. This wasn't a criminal matter, not yet, and dealing with law enforcement on property disputes could be a long, drawn-out affair. My goal was maximum impact, minimum fuss, and a direct hit on Victor's wallet and his ability to continue his reign of error. I needed to hit him where it hurt most: his property value, his legal standing, and his reputation in the eyes of the official town authorities. My target: the Fairview Code Enforcement Office and the Town Planning Department. They had the power to issue fines, demand demolition, and ultimately make Victor's life utterly miserable until he complied or simply gave up and moved away. I decided against involving Clara directly in this phase. She had been through enough, and her fight was for her property line. My fight was for the neighborhood's long-term peace. Besides, her direct involvement might alert Victor too soon, allowing him to try and mitigate the damage. I wanted to hit him with a tsunami, not a trickle. I scheduled an anonymous meeting with a senior code enforcement officer, Mr. Davies. I introduced myself as a concerned citizen of Fairview, a longtime resident who had observed some concerning patterns in the neighborhood. I brought a neatly organized binder, filled with documents, maps, and photographs. Mr. Davies was a gruff man, seen it all, heard it all. He listened patiently as I laid out my case, starting with the general pattern of Blackwood's behavior, then zeroing in on the shed and the easement. As I presented the old plat maps and the modern satellite images showing the shed squarely on the marked easement, his eyebrows slowly rose. When I showed him the lack of permits, he leaned forward, his expression hardening. "This is thorough, Mr. Croft," he said, tapping a pen on the stack of documents. "Very thorough. This shed looks like a clear violation, and if it's over a municipal storm drain access, that's a serious public safety issue." "It is," I confirmed, "and it's been there for years unnoticed. I wouldn't have even thought about it if not for recent events in the neighborhood that highlighted Mr. Blackwood's disregard for property lines and town ordinances." I kept my tone even, professional, letting the facts speak for themselves. He promised an investigation. I left the binder with him, feeling a surge of vindication. The wheels of bureaucracy might turn slowly, but they would turn, and when they did, they would grind Victor Blackwood's complacency into dust. The next few weeks were a tense waiting game. I observed Blackwood as always. He seemed a bit more nervous, glancing around as if expecting something. Maybe he had a sixth sense for impending doom. Then one crisp autumn morning, a bright orange sticker appeared on his shed, a formal notice of violation from the Fairview Code Enforcement Office. The sticker was followed by official-looking vehicles parked on the street. First a surveyor's van, then a truck from the Municipal Planning Department, then a plain white sedan from Code Enforcement. They swarmed Blackwood's property, taking measurements, inspecting the shed, consulting maps. Victor Blackwood, usually so defiant, looked utterly bewildered, then increasingly agitated. He tried to charm them, to wave them off, to offer his usual manipulative apologies, but these were government officials, impervious to his wiles. They were armed with my meticulously gathered evidence. I watched, a quiet smile playing on my lips. This was the progress I had yearned for, the fruits of my long-term observations and the methodical application of my resourcefulness. The despair I had felt at his continued impunity was replaced by a sense of righteous satisfaction. A formal summons arrived in Victor's mailbox a few days later, informing him that the shed was in violation of multiple zoning ordinances and municipal codes, particularly concerning construction on a utility easement and obstruction of a municipal access point. He was given a tight deadline to either acquire the proper permits, which given the nature of the violation was highly unlikely, or demolish the shed himself. Failure to comply would result in escalating fines and ultimately forced demolition by the town at his expense, with liens placed on his property. The financial implications alone would be devastating. Victor, for the first time in his 20 years in Fairview, seemed genuinely terrified. He tried to talk to Mr. Davies, the code enforcement officer I'd met with. I saw him practically begging on his front lawn. It was pathetic and deeply satisfying. He tried to talk to Clara, hinting that this was her doing. She merely pointed to her newly installed fence and said, "Victor, you created this situation yourself. I have no idea what you're talking about." Her unwavering stance was beautiful to behold. He hired a lawyer, a sharp, expensive-looking man from out of town. They tried to fight it, arguing technicalities, claiming he had no knowledge. But my binder, my meticulously documented evidence, was irrefutable. Every avenue they explored was blocked by facts and official records. The process was slow, but it was relentless. Each week brought a new letter, a new deadline, a new fine. The fines mounted. The legal fees accumulated. The pressure from the town became unbearable. He tried to sell his house, I heard through the neighborhood grapevine. But with the pending code violations and the liens, he couldn't find a buyer willing to take on the headache. He was trapped. Then one morning, a large moving truck pulled up to Victor Blackwood's house. Not a demolition crew, not a code enforcement team, but a moving company. I watched, my heart pounding with a quiet triumph. Furniture, boxes, all his possessions, slowly being loaded. He hadn't been forced out by legal action or direct eviction yet. But the financial ruin, the relentless pressure, the undeniable evidence that he couldn't fight had pushed him to his absolute limit. He was fleeing, not just the shed, not just the fines, but the entire history of his petty tyranny. He was leaving Fairview. It took 2 full days for the house to be emptied. On the 3rd morning, a realtor's sign appeared in the yard, for sale. The shed still stood, but the orange violation sticker seemed to glow with a quiet promise. Victor Blackwood was gone. The quiet of Fairview settled back in, deeper, more profound than before. The absence of his oppressive presence was like a collective exhale from the entire neighborhood. Clara, too, felt the change. Her fence now stood not just as a barrier, but as a monument to her resilience. Her resodded lawn was finally starting to blend in, erasing the last physical scar of Victor's actions. The final twist came a few months later, long after Victor Blackwood had vanished, and a lovely young family had bought his old house, promising to fix the shed issue. I was at the annual Fairview Community Day, talking to Mrs. Henderson, the sweet elderly woman whose backyard had been perpetually soggy from Blackwood's illegally rooted drainage pipe years ago. "You know, Silas," she said, her voice softer than usual, "I heard from my cousin, who lives near where Victor's family is from. Apparently he inherited a bit of money a few years back, but he lost most of it trying to invest in some shady online ventures. He was practically bankrupt. That's why he was so obsessed with cutting corners, with trying to get away with everything. He was desperate, always looking for an angle, always trying to save a penny, no matter who it hurt. My jadedness finally, truly, dissolved into something akin to pity, desperation. All that bluster, all that arrogance, all those years of petty aggressions stemmed from a pathetic, fear-driven desperation. He wasn't a supervillain. He was just a small, broken man trying to cling to what little he thought he had, willing to trample anyone in his path. The permanent lesson, I realized, wasn't just about his departure. It was the complete exposure of his true, pathetic nature, and the final, irrefutable proof that even the smallest, most quiet communities have ways of protecting themselves when pushed too far. Fairview was peaceful once more. The new family fixed the shed, making sure it was up to code, and they even installed proper drainage. The new neighbor, a kind man named Mark, stopped by one afternoon holding a housewarming gift. "Heard you were the one who helped Clara out with the old guy," he said, smiling. "Thanks for looking out for the neighborhood." I just nodded, a quiet, observant man, content in the restored tranquility. My work was done, and if you're looking for more stories of justice, resilience, and the triumph of peace in the face of neighborhood strife, then subscribe to Neighbours From Hell channel for new Neighbours From Hell stories daily.